For thousands of years, the Americas were home to millions of indigenous peoples. From the mighty empires of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayans in the south, to the diverse nations of the Iroquois, Cherokee, Sioux, and countless others in the north. But everything changed in 1492. The arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of one of the most devastating invasions in human history. Millions perished. Entire cultures were destroyed. Land was stolen. But the indigenous peoples resisted. This is their story. Chapter 1. The Americas. Before Columbus arrived in 1492, the Americas were already home to millions of people. Vast civilizations flourished, complex cities stood tall, and cultures thrived in ways many today do not fully realize. This is the story of America before European contact. Historians estimate that between 50 and 100 million people lived in the Americas before 1492. This land was not an uninhabited wilderness. It was home to sophisticated societies. In North America, cities like Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, had populations rivaling European cities of the same era. In Central America, the Maya had already built grand cities like Tikal and Chichen Itza. In South America, the Inca Empire stretched across the Andes, connecting millions through a vast road system. Indigenous civilizations developed advanced technologies suited to their environments. The Inca built stone structures that could withstand earthquakes and created terrace farming to grow crops in the mountains. The Maya and Aztecs built massive pyramid temples without metal tools or wheels. Indigenous peoples of North America developed extensive trade networks, linking cultures from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Native Americans were master agriculturalists. They domesticated crops that would feed the world: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans. In the Amazon, indigenous societies practiced terra preta farming, enriching the soil to sustain large populations. In the Midwest, mound-building cultures designed earthworks aligned with celestial events. Spirituality and culture were deeply woven into daily life. The Iroquois Confederacy had a system of governance that inspired modern democracies. The Aztecs recorded history in intricate codices. The Pueblo peoples built cliffside dwellings that still stand today. Music, dance, and oral traditions passed knowledge from generation to generation, shaping identities that still endure. Before 1492, the Americas were home to thriving civilizations with advanced knowledge, art, and governance. Understanding this history is crucial to honoring the resilience of indigenous cultures today. Chapter 2. The first wave of invasion, Columbus and the Caribbean. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic, searching for a route to Asia. Instead, he landed in the Caribbean, an event that would mark the beginning of European invasion, colonization, and devastation for indigenous peoples. This is the story of the first wave of invasion. On October 12, 1492, after over 2 months at sea, Columbus and his crew landed on an island in the present-day Bahamas. He named it San Salvador, but the people living there, the Taino, had known it by another name for centuries. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia. He described the Taino as peaceful and generous, but this did not stop him from claiming their land in the name of Spain. At first, relations seemed friendly. The Taino shared food, gold, and knowledge of their land, but Columbus had other plans. He immediately noted their gold jewelry and saw an opportunity for wealth. Soon, the Spanish began taking Taino people captive, forcing them to guide expeditions and mine for gold. Those who resisted were brutally punished. In 1493, Columbus returned to Spain with gold, exotic goods, and several indigenous captives. The Spanish monarchy rewarded him and sent him back with more ships, soldiers, and settlers. When he arrived in the Caribbean again, he found chaos. His men had mistreated the Taino, sparking conflict. Columbus responded with violence, ordering the mass enslavement of indigenous people and establishing brutal forced labor systems. European diseases like smallpox and measles spread rapidly, killing thousands of Taino who had no immunity. Those who survived faced forced labor and cruelty. By the early 1500s, their population had collapsed. But the Taino did not submit without resistance. Leaders like Hathaway in present-day Cuba fought against Spanish oppression, urging his people to resist. Though captured and executed, he became a symbol of indigenous resistance. Modern Caribbean landscapes, indigenous descendants, and Columbus statues being debated. Columbus's voyages marked the beginning of European conquest in the Americas, bringing immense suffering to indigenous peoples. While often glorified in history books, his legacy is one of invasion and exploitation. Today, many indigenous communities continue to fight for recognition, land rights, and the truth about their history. Chapter 3: The Spanish Conquests, Aztecs and Incas. In the early 1500s, Spain launched a brutal conquest across Central and South America. Led by conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, they brought down mighty civilizations, the Aztecs and the Inca, forever changing the history of the Americas. This is the story of how they did it. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed in Mexico with just over 600 men. He marched inland, forming alliances with indigenous groups who resented Aztec rule. The Aztecs, led by Emperor Montezuma, welcomed Cortés cautiously, believing he might be linked to their god Quetzalcoatl. But the Spanish had other plans. The Spanish massacred Aztec nobles during a religious festival. The city erupted in chaos. Montezuma was killed, and the Spanish were forced to flee in what became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But Cortés regrouped. With more indigenous allies and a devastating smallpox outbreak weakening the Aztecs, he returned in 1521, besieging Tenochtitlan. After months of brutal warfare, the once great city fell. The Aztec Empire was no more. Francisco Pizarro set his sights on the vast Inca Empire. In 1532, the Inca were weakened by a civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Pizarro took advantage, luring Atahualpa into a meeting in Cajamarca. When Atahualpa refused to convert to Christianity, the Spanish attacked, killing thousands of unarmed Incas in a single day. Atahualpa was captured, and although he paid a massive ransom in gold, the Spanish executed him anyway. With their emperor gone, the Inca resistance collapsed. In 1533, Pizarro took Cusco, and by 1572, the last Inca stronghold fell. The Spanish had advantages that made their conquest devastatingly effective: guns and steel. Spanish firearms and swords outmatched indigenous weapons. Horses. These animals gave the Spanish a psychological and military edge. Alliances. Many indigenous groups joined the Spanish to overthrow their powerful rulers. Disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza killed millions, wiping out entire populations before they could resist. The conquest brought immense suffering. Millions died, cultures were suppressed, and civilizations were lost. But indigenous resistance never ended. Today, many descendants of the Aztecs and Incas continue to fight for their rights, preserving their languages, traditions, and histories. Chapter 4: Indigenous Resistance and Survival. The European invasion of the Americas brought destruction, but indigenous peoples did not simply vanish. They resisted, fighting back against colonization, enslavement, and cultural erasure. From legendary warriors to modern movements, this is the story of indigenous resistance and survival. Cut to an animated timeline: 1500s, first rebellions; 1700s, ongoing resistance; 1800s, forced removals; 1900s, cultural survival. Today, indigenous rights movements. From the very beginning, indigenous peoples fought back. In the Caribbean, Hathaway, a Taino leader, resisted Spanish conquest in Cuba. He urged his people to fight, but after being captured, he was burned alive, choosing death over submission. In South America, the Mapuche warriors of Chile fought the Spanish for centuries, never fully conquered. In North America, tribes like the Powhatan Confederacy and the Pueblo rose up against European settlers in the 1600s, striking back against land theft and violence. Even as European empires grew, indigenous resistance never stopped. In 1680, the Pueblo Revolt in present-day New Mexico drove the Spanish out for 12 years, a rare indigenous victory. In 1780, Tupac Amaru the Sec, an Inca descendant, led a massive uprising in Peru against Spanish rule, fighting for indigenous rights. In the 19th century, leaders like Tecumseh of the Shawnee and Sitting Bull of the Lakota resisted US expansion, fighting for their people's land and way of life. Despite centuries of warfare, colonial governments resorted to new tactics, forced removals and cultural destruction. The Trail of Tears, 1830s, forced thousands of Native Americans from their lands, causing immense suffering. Boarding schools were established to erase indigenous languages and traditions, forcing children to assimilate. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890, marked one of the last armed conflicts, but it was a slaughter of unarmed Lakota people. Even after centuries of oppression, indigenous resistance never ended. It evolved. In the 1970s, groups like the American Indian Movement, AIM, fought for indigenous rights, taking back sacred sites and demanding justice. Today, indigenous activists are leading the fight against environmental destruction, such as the Standing Rock protests, 2016, against oil pipelines. Across the Americas, indigenous nations are reclaiming their languages, cultures, and lands, proving that survival is the ultimate resistance. For over 500 years, indigenous peoples have resisted colonization, fought for their rights, and preserved their cultures. Their story is not one of defeat, it is one of survival, strength, and resilience. Chapter 5: The Long-Term Impact and Indigenous Resilience. For over 500 years, indigenous peoples of the Americas have faced colonization, violence, and forced assimilation. But despite everything, they have survived. The impact of colonialism still lingers today, but so does the strength of indigenous resistance and resilience. The effects of colonization didn't end in the past, they still shape the present. Land theft and displacement. Indigenous peoples were forced off their ancestral lands, leading to economic hardship and cultural loss. Forced assimilation. Boarding schools and policies banned indigenous languages and traditions, aiming to erase indigenous identities. Systemic inequality. Many indigenous communities today face poverty, lack of healthcare, and environmental exploitation on their lands. Despite efforts to erase them, indigenous cultures are experiencing a revival. Language revitalization. Efforts across the Americas are bringing indigenous languages back through schools, apps, and community programs. Cultural pride. Traditional ceremonies, dances, and art forms are being reclaimed by younger generations. Recognition and representation. More indigenous voices are shaping policies, media, and education to tell their own stories. Indigenous activism is stronger than ever, fighting for land, justice, and environmental protection. Land back movements. Indigenous groups are reclaiming sacred lands and winning legal battles for sovereignty. Environmental defense. Indigenous activists are at the forefront of protecting the Amazon, stopping pipelines, and preserving natural resources. Political power. More indigenous leaders are entering politics, ensuring their voices are heard in national and global decisions. The struggles are not over, but indigenous peoples have proven their strength, surviving centuries of oppression and continuing to thrive. Their resilience is a testament to the power of identity, community, and resistance. Final thought. History must be remembered so that justice can be pursued. The fight is not over. It is happening now. If you found this video informative, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden history. Thank you for watching.